This is just going to be sort of a very small addendum that's just going to focus on a technical point of uh, my psychological theory and modeling. This somewhat joins with me talking about how metagram relates to the blood and metatype relates to the water. Um, I've made some much better visual aids and diagrams and laying these things out, which really also make a lot of this stuff sort of much more accessible and palpable. But I will probably at some point have to revise some of these diagrams, and I also need to finally make available through the YouTube channel uh, the 17 model in all its detail, because that's sort of a piece of the puzzle that I have not fully um, made available yet. Anyway, but just in terms of metagram, because that's been my focus of integrating these things. Because that's where sort of all the hard, complicated complexity lies as well, and trying to just understand it. So, taking metagram to be essentially the blood, essentially the karmic grooves of the beastly field circuits, and which have their particular grooves and their particular orientations and sort of how they flow in particular directions, and then how they are connected to one another through elemental symmetries. Um, Now, in the diagrams that I have made, and that I've even shown in some of my earlier recordings going through these things, I have got 5-pointed star symbols showing symmetries between metagram field circuits or particular um, emotional tones within, or it's not just one emotional tone, but essentially 5-pointed star symbols are used to show how the corner of one field circuit is correspondent to the corner of another circuit. And I think that I would want to remake that metagram diagram and remove all the 5-star. In fact, when there's only been a 5-star thing connecting two corners of two different field circuits, I would rather replace that 5-pointed star with a break to show that because in some sense, if you remove those 5-pointed stars, then you get much more what becomes clear. So the diagrams are not completely useless, because you can just say, okay, well, here's the diagram. Whenever you see a 5-pointed star, just ignore it. Imagine that there's nothing there. And then what you see because of that is that you see that there are islands of localized symmetry and connection, either field circuit connections, because a field circuit is made up of 3 corners, is made up of 6 emotional tones. And so those will always be connected with each other, but then there are, in terms of their symmetrical conjoining with one another, when you remove the 5-pointed stars, you get a much more machined, a much more mechanistic, kind of array and set of interconnecting pathways in terms of how one thing moves through one thing to become another thing. Now, the 5-pointed star things are not meaningless, but I think they are only meaningful relative to the water. So in some sense, the 5-pointed stars are metatype relevant or pertinent. They are only relevant. They do mean something, and I do think that they do show something insightful. But that insightful thing that they show is, in some sense, is actually quite usefully one of the truest, because the water is much more phenomenologically immediate in people's awareness, and people think with their metatype, and they are sort of shackled in their metagram, and so you can't really, it's not easy to see your own shackles, but you can, the metatype I think is much more intelligible, as it were. So anyway, the sort of the positioning of the five-pointed stars I think are useful because they will also perhaps elucidate perhaps sacred cows that people might have about metagram circuitry. It might be a useful component of the puzzle because when you use the metatype interpretation as to where the final five are located in someone's particular metatype structure, and then you then overlay that onto the metagram field circuits and symmetries, the positioning of those five-pointed stars are going to be phenomenologically pertinent and significant and useful, but in some sense that is a mishmash or a hodgepodge of an intersection between metatype and metagram, which is not really useful because in terms of metagram mechanics themselves, they really just detract from understanding metagram mechanics because they are not a metagram mechanic. The five-pointed stars are not metagram mechanics. But that's an interesting sort of intersection. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that. So I'm going to probably at some point. I mean, it's only two diagrams that have the five-pointed stars emblazoned onto them, and if you remove them, there are much less. Well, there are. Is it four less? I think one, two, three, four. Yeah. If you remove them, then there are four less connections, and then you get a much more. Then the blood I think becomes more overtly, if that label works, and I do think that these are the grooves that are the channel of manifestation in terms of people's embodiment, in terms of the medium of the world, materiality or karma, whatever you want to call it, or that there are somewhat basic cognitive mechanics that are that are just almost a kind of a priori sort of innate truth about the structure of consciousness or the mind, or but essentially that I derive through my model of dimensionality. So, in some sense, the 17 model really does do a lot of philosophical work within all of my psychological modeling. And that's also why I haven't focused on it so directly, because it sort of creates a lot of the overarching or fundamental sort of framework of these things, and it is, I think, useful for solving very deep philosophical problems and conundrums and things like that, but that makes it incredibly laborious and deep, because in some sense it is a kind of model that, at least the claim is that it essentially resolves and solves all philosophical sort of quandaries, essentially. Although in the a priori realm, not in the phenomenological sort of, because in some sense the 17 model is itself a pure philosophical kind of model of reality, but it's not. It doesn't actually. You have to have the metatype psychological structure, which then has its own unique. So I mean, you to understand the human condition, probably you have to sort of combine the 17 model with metatype to then kind of get to any really cogent and clear overview of sort of psychology. But if you just want to talk about philosophy somewhat in the abstract or in the pure a priori, I do think that you can get a lot of work out of the 17 model. But in some sense, that perhaps I'm talking a bit too fast and loose when I say that, because as soon as you try to sort of subtract psychology out of the picture and just try to make a sort of philosophical claim without some proper awareness, because in some sense, to try to reason through things devoid from the proper understanding of the anatomy of the conscious subject, the self, the yourself and the mechanics of yourself, maybe you can come to some broad, universal, general truths, so long as that you don't try to make philosophical moves that are impossible to import into the actual proper subjective container. So, you're kind of, you're prone to making mistakes of the kind of putting the cart before the horse. But so much as that you don't sort of cross those kinds of boundaries, the 17 model by itself can resolve some types of philosophical conundrum and quandary. But I think that there is a secondary layer of complexity in trying to actually import all of what would be that trove of insight into an actionable or reasonable model that comports with actual structures of psychology which we are saddled with and which are somewhat inescapable, and without a kind of experiential wisdom and knowledge of those things, then you might sort of be lost in some rationalization, trust garnering, or sort of narrative peddling or something like that, and not even realize it yourself. Anyway, making these anyway, so I just wanted to get that somewhat off my chest. I don't know where I'm going to fit this addendum, because I went so much into politics after talking about psychology. I don't know how I'm going to cut up all the videos or string them together, or just make a kind of 8-hour tome, as is sometimes my my solution to these problems, when I make too much content and I don't release it as I'm making it, and then I instead have recordings that deal with a myriad of different things that have been somewhat relayed simultaneously or on top of each other. It's not useful. Well, it's not easy for the audience, sadly, but anyway. Anyway. I mean, it is slightly embarrassing that I don't have a greater hold over what metagram circuitry, all the ramifications of the different circuits, and even how the more complex circuits actually operate within themselves. Apart from having them in categories. But sadly, this does require test subjects, essentially. It requires trying to find people of the same metagram type, so that I can contrast them, essentially, and then get some sort of empirical data about what these structures actually entail, that the structures in the theoretical models that I already have, essentially. But at least just having distinct categorization already, even if I can't make further very clear inroads, just being able to essentially theoretically at least, being able to psychometrically categorize people within my system and grouping them together, making those groupings then would be potentially lead to unlocking all the mysteries of psychology in short order, essentially. Although it's obviously not very satisfying having very clear explanatory power and very clear, detailed, mechanical understanding. But yeah, I mean, it's weird because I do have all these mechanics, but just I'm having problems seeing it. I do have a lot of these mechanics somewhat. There are some things that are slightly nebulous in terms of I don't know how I should interpret them, but I know that there's some kind of connection, but I don't exactly know what the mechanical impingement of the one on the other is. And then sort of that's complicated by needing to find other individuals that fall into certain categories so that I can kind of try and get an overview and a contrast of these things. And right now I'm still sort of chewing on the fact that there are these certain number of different circuit types. That there are double circuits that have elemental clones, and then there are double circuits that have corners in their stimuluses. And actually, I mean, I guess I have actually made a refinement. It's even embarrassing to state this refinement, but I just realized that, like when I was thinking about this, because I wasn't looking at my notes, because my notes were in a bit in disarray, but now they're better collected, so it's easier for me to sort of recall them and bring them up and go back to my notes. But because I was under the misapprehension that you could have a corner in a double-barreled emergent response could have a corner in it. It can't. That double-barreled emergent responses that have two emotional tones in them are always clones. They're never corners. So only the stimulus can be a corner, or the stimulus can be an elemental clone. And that, is something that, I could have technically delineated that a very long time ago. I could have seen that within the tables that I have of these things. But, it takes a while, I guess, for me to sort of play with these things and for it to sort of translate into a tangible kind of, sort of idiom that is readily at hand to have as a more simplistic sort of understanding. But the idea that it's only these stimuluses that come in these two varieties, it says something quite specific about the subconscious, about the state of the subconscious, and about the variability of the subconscious between metagram types. And there's certainly still some important keys from metatype, and because that is the whole thing that I'm trying to do. I'm trying to integrate metatype and metagram, and at some point it's going to start off after having meditated on this more and more and more. At some point, hopefully, there's going to be a breakthrough in which, and I mean, there already has been, I think, some useful breakthroughs, but in terms of cogently bringing it down into a very simplistic reduction, that the superego is doing this to the ego, and the ego or the superego in conjunction is having this effect on the subconscious, and then the subconscious is developing in this particular way. And it might you see, sadly, it's going to be a combination of realizations that, and I've really been speculating about these, that, maybe some metagram types develop their primary counteroffer and their emergent response first, and then they develop their subconscious later. Or maybe everyone starts off developing an emergent response and a primary counteroffer simultaneously, and then the stimulus is the capstone that cements your metagram type, something like that. Or you have a kind of elemental, you're toying with a particular elemental, you're toying with a particular corner between the emergent response and the primary counteroffer, and after that corner is established, then the rest of the metagram circuitry essentially proceeds to develop after that. Or, essentially, that there are two basic elements within the positive side of the mind that develops into the false ego. That there is essentially the stimulus, and then the primary counteroffer, and the emergent response, which are somewhat correlate, or always in a fixed kind of correlate with one another. And so that these two pieces of the puzzle emerge, and until they both emerge and conjoin, you perhaps have only a tentative metagram type. And so perhaps some individuals, perhaps at the age of 2 or 3 even, or perhaps between 2 and 5 even, are still tentatively settling on what their metagram configuration will be within the possibilities which exist within the metatype. And it is my contention that the metatype is somewhat more intrinsic, is somewhat more, perhaps even genetically prescribed in some way. And perhaps also, let me add this other point, although this is a completely tangential sort of topic, talking about junk DNA. I've always wondered if perhaps there was I believe that they were an American kind of, I don't know what to call them. They weren't a cult, but they were a private community, and I think for even past 10 generations, they had a kind of cultural compact within this private community. And one of the things that happened in this is that there was a historian of the community, but it was more of a psychological historian. And she made renditions of every member of every family in the entire community. And from that, there was a kind of an esoteric occultism, it was interesting that there was a tentative theory that emerged from this historical kind of record keeping, that it seemed that there was some kind of reincarnation that was taking place, or at least some kind of particular inheritance of personality that would re-emerge through the lineage. And then there was an alchemy that was understood about how this person combining with another person would create progeny that would have this kind of personality. And there was even a kind of tentative typology involved in it. And that the historian, or the people that kept these records, eventually they emerged some kind of theory. And it was interesting because they knew that the theory didn't work, but it seemed to hold some approximate water. It approximately seemed to work. It approximately kind of almost worked, but they were missing a piece of it, but they were working quite hard to try to crack the code, as it were. And anyway, I think that this might have to do with that perhaps everyone is free to construct their own metagram, but they are perhaps have to work within the bounds of their metatype. And that I think that metatypes, that there might be more of a connection between grandparents than there is a connection between direct descendants, immediate between parents and children. And why I say that is because I think that, this again is with my, look, I'm not a geneticist or anything like that, but let me just say that I believe that perhaps junk DNA perhaps we carry junk DNA and we can't make full use of it ourselves, but our descendants might make better use of it. And in some sense, there is a kind of that the people who develop and aggregate the junk DNA perhaps can't use it themselves, but store it for their descendants somewhat. And there's a transfer or a kind of communion between the metatypes or the metagram types, and there's a kind of genetic alliance between certain metatypes that are good at aggregating development of that is useful to some other. Anyway, look, I've even this is highly speculative anyway, but and I mean, this would really just be in line with some of the scriptural descriptions that the sins of the parents are visited on the children, essentially. Um, and that this would be somewhat a function, to say, of the blood, in how the blood gets recorded in a kind of genetic storage vessel, which I'm linking to junk DNA. Anyway, let me just put all of that aside. It's not really relevant to what I was actually talking about and to what is perhaps much more proper for me to contend with. So I do think that my typology would itself even add layers and layers and layers of specificity to personalized medicine. Medicine is really in a very archaic state. I mean, there are so many things within biology which we have already known all the biochemistry within the body for quite a while, but we have very little understanding as to how processes function because they are so complex. Because there's so much interrelation between different systems, and sort of the infinite combinatorial explosion makes it impossible. But if you had the further, let's say, typology of being able to designate different people, I mean, look, I think that there would also be a lot of non-linear correlates, because I remember when I was even years and years and years ago, when I worked out a version of my typology, quite a young version of my typology, I knew that it was not useful. Sorry, not it could be useful. It was when I tried to make a system that was just good at I think I was in an argument with someone or something like that, and I drove myself into developing at least what I understood about the general elements of psychology at the time, into creating a model that could designate people, that could essentially create rigid typologies. And after doing so, and this was not in the end, this was not useful, because it had no insight into how to be able to self-actualize, or how to be able to overcome one's internal developmental problems and all that sort of thing. So it was really just looking at people from the outside and being able to designate them into different categories. And it was very interesting, because I found a type that not all types share characteristics. Some types have characteristics that are very variable, but other types seem to actually never break rules. And there was this one type that I used it was crazy. Well, I mean, this sounds crazy, but there was one type who I derived looking at statistics in people that have access to databases and things like that. Um, and I can't remember the markers that were used to find these things. It was some kind of medical data as well. And we literally worked out that there was this one type of personality that always died early. Like, not that early, but died sort of before they were, like that, like there was that they, on average, they died before 50. And there was like the oldest one that we ever found in the whole database was like 53 or something ridiculous. And so there was variability, but it was basically, why the hell does this type always die so early? It was just sort of phenomenal. And I found someone in my neighborhood who was this type, and this sounds horribly horrific, and in some sense it was horribly horrific. And I informed him of this, which I did so in the most delicate way that I could. But obviously it was a bit strange having, probably I was an 11-year-old or a 12-year-old at the time, or something like that. And I told him this, and he thought that I was threatening him at first or something like that. And I don't know, he was very, this particular type has a very kind of temperamental nature to it, a very, very strangely, I and it's weird telling someone that they are likely to have an early death when you have absolutely no proper reasoning to give, but you can just say, well, and I mean, I did eventually explain it to him, at least the rationale that I had taken, but all I actually did was encourage him to have his affairs in order and to probably believe that I'm that this is untrue, because the and he did in fact die quite young. I think he was in his late 40s, or perhaps even I think he was around 45. And that happened about, I can't exactly remember, I think about 7 years after, 7 or 8 years. I think it didn't really happen that much later. Anyway, I mean, there's a horrific kind. I mean, this is. I mean, I've done things that are perhaps slightly scandalous. I mean, I consider this to be a very embarrassing and strange sort of thing. But I think what I did was that I didn't just walk up to this man and do this or something like that. Because I remember I was talking to someone about this whole issue, one of my peers, one of my contemporaries at the time, and I was describing this type of person who I believe has this kind of early death. And he said, "Oh, I know someone. There's someone like that who lives in our neighborhood." And I didn't know them at the time. I mean, I had maybe seen them from afar, but I'd never spoken to them. And then I remember telling my peer who I was talking to, well, if he is that type. And I remember asking more and more questions, confirming if he was that type. And he said, "Oh, then he will die, or he will have an early death." And it's, I mean, I'm not cursing him. I'm not prophesying. This is just a kind of statistical thing. And I mean, I mean, I guess he could be the outlier. I mean, I think I made that concession. Um, Look, I mean, I don't. I even then I was sensitive to relying on things like statistics, but and I mean, it was obviously very weird because I don't even know the reason why this type exactly has an early death. Um, and I think my peer might have dared me to tell him or something like that, and I said, okay, well, I don't think it might be good to tell someone this, that it's a poison pill on some level, and it certainly would be hard to believe. And I think what I did was I almost stalked this guy. and I tried to first just have a conversation with him, and I tried to first just kind of see if I could work out from the outside, why do these types have an early death? And I did find a way to somewhat infiltrate his life just so that I could observe him. I can't remember exactly what it was. I think he had children which were about 3 years older than me, so there was kind of, I can't remember exactly what the pretext was, but somehow I was able to somewhat be in his vicinity just so that I could observe him. And I think after having about 3 conversations with him, and after being somewhat exposed to him, I think one of the things that I said in one kind, because I think he asked me, like, why are you watching me, or why are you observing me, or something like that, or why are you interested in observing me? And I just sort of bluntly told him as delicately as I could, but I laid it out, and I tried to lay it out, and he really misapprehended me in ways in which that, I always find it odd that people don't follow things when I'm being very precise and delicate, how they sort of really selectively edit things that they interpret quite badly. And that I found strange, and I thought that might have something to do with why this type has an early death. But anyway, man, this is such a strange sort of memory. But and I think, well, this whole project of trying to designate types, it was interesting that, because already then I came to a very firm conclusion that some types seem to share features with each other, other types don't share features with each other. There's more variability. But what's also weird is how some types go one way or another way. Like, there are certain types, and specialists in the medical field know this very, very well. If you are a specialist that only deals with brain tumors, or you are a specialist that only deals with one organ and one pathology, very clearly these specialists will often say, the people that sit in the chair that I'm giving the test results to, and that they are getting a diagnosis of the pathology, they already thought that they might have that pathology because they are so used to that type of personality, that type of person that looks this type of way, having this pathology, that there's a trope. There is some trope that seems also to be linked to their personality, their expression, their mannerisms, perhaps, or something like that. And it's also interesting that some of these types, I think, either develop one of two sort of, the cancer of this organ or the cancer of this completely other organ. But they often develop one or the other. And that's interesting, because that itself might also be a particular clue as to how psychosomatic stress, if I can put it like that, will manifest in one of two physiological anatomical locations. And that these things, that the psychology and the physiology are somewhat bound in the blood. And to say that the metagram circuitry becomes the thing that fuels the consciousness, that becomes the thing that is the conduit through which the motivation carried by the water is embodied in the flesh and feeds the flesh and drives the flesh, and is the conduit of the channel of manifestation into making the word flesh, into making the witness of the word, which is the water, predominantly. So, well, I mean, I have perhaps that's an element of the 17 model, which is that, in my view, the spirit is more akin to being a witness of the Father. The water is more akin to being a witness of the Word, and the blood is more akin to being a witness of the Holy Ghost. But in some sense, because the Trinity are one, you can also conflate that and say that each of these three witnesses are all witnesses to the Trinity, because it's one Trinity. But anyway. Okay, I mean, let me stop this recording. But yeah, I mean, this is all the things that I go through. But yeah, perhaps a bit interesting.